Okay, let's get into chapter 41. Chapter 41, Joseph is still in prison, at least as we left off in chapter 40. In chapter 40, Joseph has these two so-called friends that he meets, I guess for lack of a better word, the head baker and the cupbearer, the chief cupbearer, both of whom are these sort of political leaders. They're not just kind of the waiters and the servants of Pharaoh. They have some kind of political pull, and they're there with Joseph in prison, and they both have dreams, and Joseph interprets those dreams, and the dreams come true exactly as Joseph said. Remember, in Egypt, dreams carry weight. Dreams are the ways that the gods communicate with you. And so Joseph interprets these dreams. They come to pass to be right. The head baker is killed, and the cupbearer is restored to his place of prominence. So that leads us then to chapter 41. In chapter 41, Randall, I might need some help with the clicker. Sorry. Just go ahead and put me on the next slide and everything as it comes, and that'll be all right. You're good. I'll keep going. Chapter 41 begins with Joseph being in prison for 2 years since the release of the cupbearer. Now, you think that Joseph might have lost hope during that time, and I'm not so sure that he did. He tells the cupbearer when the cupbearer is released in chapter 40, remember me. Say something good about me so I can get out of here. And as many of us are guilty of, the cupbearer forgets, or at least it slips his mind. And so what caused the cupbearer then to remember Joseph? Well, Pharaoh has some dreams, and these dreams, because we have the interpretation, we might think, well, Pharaoh, how could you miss this? It seems kind of obvious the way the dreams are, the way they're constructed, that the interpretation might be obvious, but it's not. And so the dreams go like this. Pharaoh dreams first that there are 7 fat cattle, and then 7 lean cattle come out of the Nile. That's important. They come out of the Nile and they devour the 7 fat cattle. And then the Bible says, and Pharaoh woke up. Well, I think I would wake up too after seeing a cow eat a cow. I've seen a lot of cows in my life, never seen a cow eat a cow. He has another dream, and there are 7 heads of grain. They're good, healthy heads of grain on a stalk, and then there are these lean heads of grain that have been scorched by the wind that devour the healthy heads of grain. And then Pharaoh woke up, and I suppose I would too. Now, we know the interpretation of the dream, and we'll talk about the interpretation of the dream in just a minute. But why would Pharaoh not understand the interpretation of the dream? Why would he be so confused about this? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. Number one, let's take the first dream of the cattle. The 7 lean cattle come out of the Nile. The Nile was considered a god in Egypt. And so, is this a message from the gods? Well, it's a dream, and in Egyptian thought, the dreams were how the gods communicated with the Egyptians. And so you have something bad coming out of the Nile. What could that represent? It could represent infertility, because the Nile was responsible for making the land of Egypt fertile with plant life and with agriculture and things like that. Could be. It could also be a sign of war. It could be an omen of war, because there's something bad coming out of the source that makes Egypt what it is. And remember, the Nile is a river, and that's really the only way in and out of Egypt without having to go over all these mountains and cliffs and things like that. And so it could be a sign of invading forces. So I can understand. I might give Pharaoh a pass for not understanding and for being afraid of that dream. Okay, the second dream then is about agriculture, about these heads of grain that are healthy being eaten up by these scorched heads of grain. Egypt was the breadbasket of the known world. I think you all probably know that. The Nile would flood, and when it flooded every year, it was like Old Faithful. It flooded same time every year. They had that season. And it would deposit this silt, this fresh silt, onto the land, and the river would subside, leaving that fresh silt, and you just had new soil every year, new, good, nutrient-rich soil. And so that's how Egypt was able to produce all of the agricultural commodities that it could. And so one thing we might think of with the grain dream, with the heads of grain, is that it might represent an economic collapse. Egypt is the breadbasket of the known world. How do they make their money? They make their money by supplying this commodity to the world. And so it could be an economic collapse. That might be one interpretation Pharaoh could think. Another one could also be military invasion. That's obviously true of all of these. I think the Pharaoh is every time going to think of a military invasion. It could also be, I don't want to use the word famine because that's the interpretation that Joseph is going to give, but it could have something to do with the production of food in some sense. I know a couple of you in here have been to Egypt, but I think when we think about Egypt, we think about all the hieroglyphs that are written on the walls and all the documentation that we have and papyrus scrolls and things like that. And that's true, we have a lot of those things. They kind of fall into one of three categories. One, they're funerary text, and so it's like hieroglyphs when people die. The other is magical text. So spells to protect you in the afterlife or maybe even in this life. And then the third, believe it or not, is recipes. The Egyptians knew how to cook and they made a lot of cookbooks. And the biggest food stuff that they made was bread. And the second biggest was beer. And you make beer with grain. And so I think here Pharaoh might be thinking economic collapse, but who knows? We're not led to believe that. We're just led to see how Pharaoh might have reacted to these dreams if we look at it through his lens. Okay, so Pharaoh has these dreams and he gets nervous about it. And so he calls in, your Bible may say the magicians. And I'm curious about this because it's not entirely clear in an English Bible what class of people this is. You look in verse 8, it says, in the morning he was troubled, so he called for the diviner priest of Egypt, my Bible says. And your Bibles may say magicians or something like that. Anybody say anything different? Soothsayers, okay. Anybody else? Okay. That's interesting, soothsayer, because a soothsayer is not a soothsayer is a prophet of sorts that reads the signs in order to determine the future, which is not entirely what this is. This is a Hebrew word that is not a Hebrew word at all. If you're reading Genesis in Hebrew, the word is chartom. That first letter, Hebrew reads from right to left, and so that first letter there is a het, and it's got that guttural sound. That's why it's not hartom, it's chartom. It is not a Hebrew word. It's an Egyptian loan word. And the Egyptian word is the word hayertep. Now, the reason, I don't want you to get focused so much on the vowel sounds because Hebrew originally didn't have vowels with the text, and neither did Egyptian. Egyptian was written in hieroglyphs to begin. And so, but you can see maybe the consonantal forms similarly there with the H and the R and the T sounds, and that's fine. That means nothing to you. I just want you to know this is not a Hebrew word. It's an Egyptian word written in Hebrew. And so if you go do a word study and you look this up in a Hebrew lexicon, you need to really look it up in an Egyptian lexicon. Okay? So here's what it is. This is a specific class of priest who specialize in dream interpretation. Now that probably doesn't make much sense to us because what we know about priest from our Old Testament is Israelite. And Israelite priests tend to have the exact same job. Whether you're a priest or a high priest, you have basically the same job. High priest a little more specialized in that you go in on the Day of Atonement and do some special things. But your job as a priest in Israel is to offer sacrifice on behalf of the people, at least at the boiled down point. That's your job as a priest. In Egypt, you could specialize in things. And so you have priests who specialize in the formation of idols. You have priests who specialize in sacrifice. You have priests who specialize in caring for the Apis bull. You have priests who specialize in dream interpretation. You have priests who specialize in magic. So when Moses in the book of Exodus throws his staff on the ground and it becomes a serpent, and the Egyptian magicians are able to cast their staff on the ground and they become serpents, that's a totally different class of priests. Okay? So in Egypt you have different people to do different things. So this class is specific, and it's specific for dream interpretation. Now there is a word, a three-letter word in verse 8 That is very, very important. Pharaoh called for all these people. Not some, not most, all. Now, I don't know how many all was. Could have been 100, could have been 2. I have no idea. But he called for all of them. And none of them could interpret the dreams. Now, here's the thing. Does that mean they didn't have an opinion? Probably not, because if you're called as a priest to Pharaoh and you don't offer something, you're probably going to get killed because you're not doing your job. I think that probably what happened, although the text doesn't say it, I'm speculating admittedly, is that they just couldn't agree. I mean, let's say that there were 10 of them and they all had different interpretations. Well, that's not going to help anybody. So, that's basically that. They don't have any good suggestion for what the dream means. Insert cupbearer, who after 2 years remembers his happy little conversation with Joseph. Oh, hey, there was a guy I was in jail with, and we had these dreams, and he interpreted them. You should go ask him. Fair enough. And Pharaoh does. So, when Joseph is called to Pharaoh, he has to change his appearance. Look at verse 14. It says, Then Pharaoh summoned Joseph. So they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. He shaved himself, changed his clothes, and came before Pharaoh. Now that may not mean much to us as 21st century American readers, but it is the start of a trajectory with Joseph that we will see climb and climb and climb until the end of Genesis. And that is the trajectory of Joseph becoming culturally Egyptian. Now, why does that matter? Because when you get to Exodus, all the Hebrews are culturally Egyptian. We read over that, but they are. Don't believe me? There are at least, at minimum, 6 names in the book of Numbers alone of the Hebrews that are unquestionably Egyptian names. Korah being one of them. And Korah was a priestly name, and so some have speculated that Korah served as an Egyptian priest, even as a Hebrew. I think they're right. Another conversation for another time. So the Hebrews had this trajectory of assimilating to Egyptian culture. Now, before we get into that and see this a little bit more, remember when God prophesied in some sense to Abraham, He said, your descendants are going to be in Egypt and they're going to be captive there. This is all the way back to Abraham. You know, we've been out of Abraham for a long time. And then what we'll see in the next couple of chapters is that Jacob and his sons go to Egypt, and God tells them, it's okay. Go to Egypt. So, why is it then a bad thing that they're in Egypt when we get to Exodus? I think the answer is, and this isn't my answer, I'm stealing it from someone, but I think you're right. God said go to Egypt. He never said stay in Egypt. And they go to Egypt and they get comfortable in the land of Goshen and they stay there and it doesn't work out in their favor at all. Okay, so let's get back to Joseph. Joseph has to, number one, shave himself. Egyptian men in particular, and especially the priests, shave their entire bodies. So this isn't Joseph went and got a haircut. Joseph shaved his entire body, head to toe. You say, well, what about the Egyptian pharaohs who have the long beards? Those beards are prosthetics. Did you know that? They're not real. They would either be glued to the chin or be held on the ear by some piece of string or something like that. They were totally prosthetics. If you were Egyptian royalty or an Egyptian priest, you shaved your entire body. He's also given new clothes. Well, what's wrong with the clothes he had? Well, the clothes he had were probably the clothes of a slave. He's obviously been in jail for 2 years. I would imagine he doesn't have the best Brooks Brothers suit, so he had to be given new clothes. I think what we're seeing here is the beginnings of Joseph taking on the role of an Egyptian priest. Now, how do we know that? Well, one, he shaves himself, which is exactly what an Egyptian priest would do. And number two, he's fulfilling the role of an Egyptian priest by being a dream interpreter. All right? So keep that in the back of your mind whenever we get into more of the Joseph story, especially with who Joseph marries and his children and things like that. It's going to play a big role. So Joseph comes to Pharaoh and he interprets the dream. And I call it here a shocking interpretation, and I think so, because take the other interpretations that we suggested, military conquest and economic downfall. Well, in the course of a civilization, you're going to have both of those things, and Egypt was no stranger to either. And so, they're terrible things, and we would never want them for any civilization, but you might expect that. What you would not expect is famine, because Egypt was the breadbasket of the world. Nothing bad happens to the food source in Egypt. And so Joseph gives this interpretation. These are 7 years of good and 7 years of famine. And that's the interpretation of the dream. But that's not where Joseph stops. You look in verse 33. Joseph says, "So now Pharaoh should look for a wise and discerning man and give him authority over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh should do this. He should appoint officials throughout the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, they should gather all excess food during these good years that are coming. By Pharaoh's authority, they should store up grain so the cities will have food, and they should preserve it." And so basically, store up during the good times so you'll have in times of famine. Now, here's the problem. Pharaoh never asked for Joseph's opinion. All Pharaoh wanted was an interpretation of the dream. Y'all, Joseph had to have some kind of intestinal fortitude, because you don't just tell the leader of the known world what to do, especially when he doesn't ask. And here's something else Joseph doesn't do. Joseph does not suggest himself to fulfill that role. He just says, might be wise, might be something worth thinking about if you did this. And Pharaoh quite likes that idea, so Pharaoh asks, can we find someone like Joseph? I love this question, verse 38. Can we find someone like Joseph? Well, the rhetorical answer is no. Joseph is specially put in this position, I think, obviously by the providence of God, although that can certainly be debated with how much God's role plays in our lives. But Joseph was there for some specific reason to which God is going to work through Joseph and in Joseph. And so the rhetorical answer is no, there's no one like Joseph. Now, the interesting thing about this question is it continues. Can we find someone like Joseph in whom the Spirit of God is present? Now, does that mean that Pharaoh believed in God? Not necessarily. But here's why it's so ironic for Pharaoh to ask that question. Can we find someone like Joseph in whom the Spirit of God is present? Well, Pharaoh was supposed to be the one in whom the Spirit of God was present, because Pharaoh was considered to be the son of God. He was the son of the sun god Ra, or Re, or in some cases Horus. He was God on earth. And so shouldn't it be the case that Pharaoh is the one through whom God works? Do you see the irony in this? We're looking for someone who is wise, someone who sees a problem before the problem becomes a problem, and someone who has the Spirit of God. And Pharaoh should have been all of those as a political leader. But he's looking for someone like Joseph. The very person he was looking for should have been himself to take charge of this situation, but it wasn't. And so, obviously, no one like Joseph is there, and Pharaoh sets Joseph in charge of dealing with the problem before the problem becomes a problem. It was his idea anyways. And so, he puts Joseph in second in command over the entire country. The only person to outrank Joseph is Pharaoh himself. Another reason to believe that this is during the invasion of the Hyksos rather than the actual ethnic Egyptians is because no Egyptian would have put a Hebrew in power like that at all. It just wouldn't have happened. So Pharaoh signifies Joseph's power in a number of ways. He gives him a signet ring, fine clothing, and a gold chain. You see here an example of a signet ring. This is actually a brass signet ring that belonged to King Tut. And the cartouche on this, which is like the hieroglyph for a name, does not read Tutankhamun. It reads his throne name, and I would butcher it if I tried to pronounce it, which is very interesting because Joseph has a name change, right? So Joseph has his name changed to Zaphanat Paneah. Not entirely sure what the meaning of that is, but probably some kind of way to acknowledge an Egyptian god of some sort. But it could be the case, because biblical scholars and archaeologists say, well, there's no evidence that Joseph was ever in Egypt. And I'm kind of curious, I wonder if they're looking for the right name. I'm wondering if they're looking for, if they're not looking for a throne name when they should be. So who knows? I mean, that's another conversation for another time. All right, so he's given all of these things. He's given a woman to be his wife. Her name is Asenat. She is the daughter of Potipharah, which is not the same as Potiphar. Potiphar and Potipharah are the same name, but we're obviously dealing with two different individuals. First of all, the Hebrew text spells them differently. Potiphar is like an abbreviated form of Potipharah. But Potiphar is the captain of the guard, and Potipharah is a priest of On. On is the city Heliopolis. It's the same, if you're familiar with the Egyptian geography. On and Heliopolis, same place. It's where the temple to the sun gods were. Now, why would Joseph be given the daughter of a priest? Well, what's Joseph's job? He's a dream interpreter, right? He's kind of playing into this whole Egyptian priest thing. They have two children. Their children's names are Ephraim and Manasseh. There's a ton of debate as to whether or not these are Hebrew or Egyptian names. I am of the thinking that Manasseh is an Egyptian name and Ephraim, or Ephraim, is a Hebrew name. Now, that poses a significant question. Just how Egyptian did Joseph get? I'm passionate about this because at the core, this is what my dissertation is about. So I'm sorry to bore you, but I think sometimes we read the text as if whatever character we're reading about is the superhero of faith for whatever faith we're thinking about, whether it be the Jewish faith or the Israelite faith or the Christian faith in the New Testament. And I don't think that is the case with people, because no one is perfect, and we are the products of our surroundings. And if Joseph has been in Egypt and he's willing to change parts of himself, maybe we should give that a little more thought. Okay, so we're not entirely sure how assimilated he became, but obviously he became assimilated somewhat. Okay, chapter 42 then. Chapter 42, the famine has now reached the rest of the world, let's say. So we've had 7 years. So how long has it been since Joseph and his brothers have seen each other? Well, you have 2 years in prison plus 7 years plus however long he was with Potiphar. Been a minute, right? Which is so interesting because when the brothers come to Egypt, Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. Okay? And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit. Okay, so the famine has reached the rest of the world, and chapter 42 begins in sort of a ironic and hilarious way. It says, when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, my Bible translates this, why are you looking at each other? That's kind of funny. He said then, look, I hear there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy grain for us so that we may live and not die. Another question we might ask is, how serious was the famine for Jacob and his sons? Because in chapter 43, when they go back to Egypt, they carry all kinds of gifts, and a lot of those gifts are food. So we're not really sure how bad the famine was. But we're led to contrast again the actions of the brothers with the actions of Joseph. Joseph is very proactive. There's a problem. The problem needs solved. Here's how you solve the problem. Joseph's a leader. And the brothers in this famine, the ones who are in a patriarchal society, the ones who are to lead their families and lead the clan, are just sitting around looking at each other. Oh, I don't know what to do. Can I tell y'all, that is the marker of a dead church. Is when people just sit around and look at each other and don't do anything. And that usually stems from bad leadership, just to be completely fair. But a dead church are people who just sit around and look at each other. Okay, that's what these brothers are doing. And Jacob says, hey, get up, go to Egypt and get some grain for us. Now, when they come into Egypt, Joseph does recognize them. They do not recognize him. The text never does this, whether in the Gospel of Luke or in Genesis, but I do think it's an interesting parallel to make between Jesus and the men on the road to Emmaus. Because the men on the road to Emmaus were disciples of Jesus. And they walk with Jesus for about 7 miles or so between Emmaus and Jerusalem. And they have no idea that they're walking with Jesus. until they do. And I just find the parallel really strong here that Joseph's brothers spend all this time with him and never recognize him until they do. And when they do, it changes their lives completely. So maybe a parallel to make, just a marginal note in passing here. Verses 11 through 13, again, are interesting. They come into Egypt and they're trying to buy grain. Joseph says, "You're spies." I mean, he recognizes them, right? And he says, "You're spies." And here's their response to that in verse 11. They say, "We are the sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." "No," he insisted, "but you have come to see if our land is vulnerable." They replied, "Your servants are from a family of 12 brothers. We are the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. The youngest is with our father at this time, and one is no longer alive." So they make a claim that they're honest men, and then proceed to lie right to Joseph's face. Boy, if that isn't just the picture of a Christian life. I mean, sometimes we can think we're a whole lot holier than we really are. And it's a dangerous thing when we stand before God and confess our holiness whenever we need to really fix ourselves. So they say that they're honest men. They proceed to lie. And Joseph, obviously kind of playing with them, holds them in, our Bibles calls it prison. It's not really prison. The word there is asaf, and it means to gather. So he held them in a gathering place. And the word asaf, consonantally, is the same makeup as the word Joseph. And so if you're reading this in Hebrew and you're a native Hebrew reader, you see a play on words, which Hebrew does quite often. Hebrew is very punny. And so if you're reading this in Hebrew, it's like Joseph is right there in front of your face. You can't miss it. It's in every sentence of the page. And yet here these guys are just missing Joseph over and over again. They just can't seem to understand it. Now, Joseph tells them, "You have nothing to worry about." And the reason you have nothing to worry about, which, Joseph wants his brothers to go back and get Benjamin. Benjamin is Joseph's full brother. And bring Benjamin back. And if they do that, then that'll prove that they're honest men and that they're not spies and that they're there just to buy grain. And so Joseph says, "Look, I'm going to keep one of you with me." Simeon's the one that he keeps. The rest of you go back, get Benjamin, bring him, and I'll let you go. Joseph tells them that he fears God. And why is that important? Well, these brothers also should have been God-fearers. And when you really fear God, and I don't mean that you're afraid of God, I mean you revere God and you respect God and you know that God says what He means. When you do that, your actions and your behaviors change. They have to. Well, his brothers should have feared God, and yet their actions against Joseph prove quite the opposite. But Joseph fears God, and so they can take his word to the bank. Joseph's going to be true to his word. So Joseph convinces them. They go back, and in verse 37, Reuben speaks up. They tell their father Jacob all of this, and Jacob, of course, is worried and refuses to send Benjamin back. And Reuben says, "You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will bring him back to you." Now, do you remember which brother spoke up when all the rest of them wanted to throw Joseph or wanted to kill Joseph? Which one spoke up and said, "Don't kill him"? It was Reuben, right? Reuben kind of has the character trait of the protector of his brother. Now, Reuben is not going to be the one to convince Jacob to do this. That's going to fall on Judah, which is kind of interesting. But Reuben at least takes the lead and stands up first. That leads us then to chapter 43, the last chapter we're going to talk about tonight. Chapter 43, the famine becomes more severe. And as it becomes more severe, it seems to Jacob that we're going to have food from somewhere. And so it is not Reuben who speaks up again, but it's Judah. And Judah says, put Benjamin in my charge. If something happens to him, then I'll take the blame. And Judah really pleads. He tells the story over again. And as he pleads, Jacob finally becomes convinced. And maybe we can hear the heartbreak in Jacob's voice when he says in verse 14, may the sovereign God grant you mercy before the man so that he may release your other brother and Benjamin. As for me, if I lose my children, I lose them. Those are the words of a hopeless man. And Jacob knows the promise that has been given to Isaac and Abraham to be the father of nations and to have descendants spread on the earth. He knows all that. But can we give him a pass for maybe doubting a little bit? Because in his mind, he's already lost Joseph. He's lost Simeon. And now he's about to lose Benjamin probably, at least in his mind. And it can be so tempting to look at someone like Jacob and say, okay, maybe you lost Joseph in your mind and now Simeon is gone, but Simeon is a grown man able to take care of himself. And you have 10 other sons, get over it, Jacob. How dare we ever think a thought? Can I give you one piece of practical advice that has nothing to do with our lesson tonight? If you ever know of someone who's lost a child, don't you dare have the audacity to say, well, at least you have others. That is absolutely heartless and ridiculous. So as we read our Bibles and remember that the people we're reading about were real people who had real emotions, real feelings, and real difficulties, maybe we can sympathize with them a little more than we usually do. So, Jacob is hopeless. The brothers then leave with Benjamin. They come into Egypt. Joseph sees them. He has a meal prepared for them. He becomes lost in emotion at seeing his full brother. I think Joseph still had some kind of a love for his other brothers. I mean, obviously, he didn't kill them, and they sure deserved it. But, Benjamin is his full brother, the son of his mother Rachel. And Joseph is full of emotion here. And in verse 26, when Joseph meets his brothers again, it says, when Joseph came home, they presented him with gifts they had brought inside, and they bowed down to the ground before him. Well, that phrase, they bowed down, that's kind of important. Do you remember maybe some dreams that Joseph had back in chapter 37 about stars bowing down to one star and sheaves of grain bowing down to one sheaf of grain? And the brothers said, there's no way in this world we'll ever bow down to you. In fact, we're going to kill you. That way, it never happens. Well, it's fulfilled here. So they bow down to Joseph. And Joseph invites them in for a meal. When they do this, I want to pay special attention here to verse 31 and I guess following to the end of the chapter. It says, then he washed his face and came. He was, tore up with emotion at seeing Benjamin and talking to Benjamin, and he went away crying and washed his face and came out. With composure, he said, set out the food. They set a place for him, separate place for his brothers, and another for the Egyptians who were eating with him. Now, in my Bible, this is in parentheses. In your Bibles, it may not be, but it says, the Egyptians are not able to eat with the Hebrews, for the Egyptians think it is disgusting to do so. Well, let's think about that. I think very clearly this is a parenthetical statement. And I don't remember the Hebrew text, but it's probably a disjunctive vowel there signifying a parenthetical statement, which is fine. Traditionally, who's the author of Moses? Or the author of Genesis? Moses. Moses grew up as an Egyptian. Right? If anyone knew Egyptian culture, it was Moses. And the Egyptians were not quite germaphobes, but they were clean people. And I don't mean like ritualistically and morally clean, like we think about the Israelites. They were just very clean people. In fact, when Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, what is it that she's doing? You may remember? She's bathing in the Nile, right? Which could have been a form of worship, but you've got fresh water there available. And the Nile was a dangerous place, mind you. Crocodiles and hippopotamuses, among other things, snakes and so forth. But you have fresh water there available to you for whatever. You've got the means of cleanliness, and the Egyptians were very clean people. Even the Egyptians who worked out in the fields and labored were very clean people. Okay, so why then do they think that the Hebrews are disgusting? Now, I think that's a good translation of the term here. Well, what did a Hebrew do for a living? They were shepherds. Genesis 46 says that the Egyptians viewed shepherding as detestable, that it was a horrible job. You know, I grew up, all y'all know, I grew up on a farm. I talk about living on a farm quite a lot, and it made me who I am today. I talk a lot about raising cattle. We did raise cattle. Of course, we had horses and sheep and chickens and so forth. My favorite animal that we had on the farm was a pig. I loved raising hogs. I loved showing pigs in 4-H and FFA. I thought they were so much fun. But my job every morning at 5 o'clock in the morning was to go feed the pigs. Every day. Before school. There's not enough dove in this world to get the smell of hog off of you. Now imagine being a shepherd. Sheep don't smell that great either. Imagine being a shepherd and not having water to bathe with. I mean, nobody wants to be around that. So imagine this. You have Joseph, second in command in Egypt, sitting with lowly, detestable, deplorable shepherds, and the rest of the Egyptians in his court eating with them. And Joseph treats them very well. It says in verse 34, the very last phrase, they drank with Joseph until they all became drunk. Now, this isn't a lesson on drinking or drunkenness, but my understanding, at least, is you don't usually drink with people you don't like. So there's something about fellowship here. And I think that's the important part of the text. Fast forward then to the New Testament. What did all these religious goody two-shoes think about Jesus? He ate and drank with tax collectors and sinners. He had fellowship with the deplorables, with the people he shouldn't have been around, right? As a Jewish rabbi, it should have had nothing to do with people like the drunks and the prostitutes and the tax collectors and thieves. But that's to whom the message went. I think there's a great theological truth here for us today. And we'll go ahead and put that up there, that Joseph didn't show any ill will towards his brothers. First of all, it's a great lesson in forgiveness, which we'll see in chapter 44 and onward. But it's also a great theological truth for us. First of all, on forgiveness. And second of all, and maybe somewhat more importantly from the context of this text, spending time with people that the world says you shouldn't spend time with. It seems to me, as an observer of church stuff, that we are very, very good about ministering to those who look like us, who talk like us, who make the same amount of money that we make, who work with us and go to school with us. We're not very good at reaching those who are the deplorables, let's say. Now, do congregations have programs designed to help people and reach people like that? Sure. But you know, there are very few times in the New Testament when a congregation is called to develop a program in order to reach people. The New Testament is pretty clear. You go. When you have opportunity, you go. I think there's something very powerful here about being willing to break those cultural norms and be culturally absurd. I mean, in every respect, Joseph was an Egyptian, but he did the absolutely absurd.